Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
And welcome to this free masterclass dedicated to the subject of starch, and more specifically to starch in gluten-free pastry and gluten-free baking. It's been a while. We haven't been doing these masterclasses, so after the summer holidays, we are excited to be with you again, and we hope that many of you will join us and that you will find the information that we're going to share today useful. So let's start talking about starch.
I think that this is your special, no? Together with the proteins, Adrianna, we can say that the starches also are really interesting for you. And
I really like starch and proteins for the same reason, because I think they are both a little underrated, like pastry ingredients. So the proteins, I always say they're the superheroes because we use very small quantity and we can achieve big things and amazing textures. And with starch, maybe we use more quantity in our recipes, but I think that pastry chefs work with starch without thinking, oh, I'm using starch, or without knowing the molecular composition of starch. We use starch every day, every time we use flour, but we just say, okay, I work with this flour or this type of flour, or I work with gluten-free flour, but we're not thinking that anytime we work with flour, whether it comes from cereals or maybe if we use some, the cereal flour, every time we have some starch present in the flour, and it's actually about 70 to 80% of the flour. So it's really an important ingredient that we work with every day.
Something that I agree with you is that pastry chef, no, I mean this group, I think that we don't know nothing about the starches, no? Since I started to work in pastry, I was working with the starches, and for me, a starch from potato or from corn was exactly the same. I didn't know the difference, and now, since I think 2-3 years that you started to study all the starches and start to understand the difference between ones and the other ones, we have started to play with different starches in order to have different textures and work on different ways on the different doughs that we use in pastry.
I agree with you completely, Jordi. I remember that I was always surprised why such a classic recipe like pastry cream has so many variations, right? Because the pastry cream that I learned at pastry school, for example, was made with cornstarch. Then I see on the website, in many pastry books or on different websites, like potato starch, or then even like no starch, or just add a very small quantity of regular flour. And I could never understand it, because it seemed like it's the same recipe and the only thing that changes is the starch, right? Or flour, but in this case it would be wheat starch, until I actually started to read and learn about starches. So today we want to talk about all of this, because this was our discovery some years ago, and we are still learning, because the world of starch is changing at an incredible pace. I think some time ago we made this blog post that fiber is the future of pastry, but I have to add to this blog post that quite soon, I think starches will also catch up, because there are so many varieties, starches and plant-based proteins, that they really become like a very versatile ingredient that can be applied to almost any food sector, right? In baking, in pastry, in frozen desserts,
as if you see in the industrial products, if you go to a supermarket, you can see a starch in a vegan yogurt, for example, for the texture.
Exactly.
You can see a starch on the pastry products that they sell, on the pastry products that has long shelf life. You can see a starch in many of the products that we use in the big productions, in the industrial productions, and we consume because we buy products in the supermarkets.
That's right, Jordi. Nowadays, starch, right, as a texturizing agent, every time gains more and more importance. It's also combined a little bit with the change once we try to go more plant-based, right, or eliminate the ingredients of animal origin. We have some textural problems that we have to fix, and starch very often helps us fix those problems.
At home, I'm consuming yogurt, a kind of yogurt, vegetable yogurt with almond and almond milk is made, and almond paste and almond and water. But the textures, because they don't add fats like, for example, coconut fat, they just work with the natural fats that comes from the almond, unsaturated fats. This is because it's healthier, no? But they work just with starch in order to create the structure that we need for have the creaminess that is not like something that we need in a yogurt, no? In a vegetal preparation of this kind of products.
I cannot agree more with you, Jordi. Starch is one of the, let's say, maybe the cheapest or the easiest way to build creaminess in textures that are water-based, that lack, right, the thickening that would normally come from either from animal proteins or from cream, from milk, right? So whenever we take out those ingredients from our recipes and we are left with more, let's say, water-based recipe, we can add, just by adding a little bit of starch, we can bring back the creaminess because the texture changes, right? It's thicker, it has more body, and the yogurt automatically feels creamier, just like it should be. Mm-hmm. So this is like a general introduction of what is going on and the examples of products where you can see starch already being applied in a new way, right? Because traditionally we saw starch as a thickener, starch applied in pastry creams or sauces to thicken the sauce, right? But nowadays we use it to thicken or to build creaminess in yogurts. We use it for many other texturizing purposes, and we will talk about it today. But to start from the very basics, Jordi, let's start with starch. Exactly what is what is starch, because I think we already started giving a lot of information. But let's start from the very beginning, and I can see. For people that are just joining us now, Marta left us a message Marta and Maria left us a message that we have people joining from all parts of the world. We are really very excited and very grateful that you are here with us today from Indonesia, Canada, Germany, South Africa, Portugal, Israel, Singapore, Chile, Australia. Wow.
Thank you. Thank you.
Amazing international crowd. So thank you very much for watching us today. So without further ado, we will talk about what is starch, what are the starch, what is the starch molecular composition, what is the role of starch in pastry and gluten-free baking. Basically, Jordi, I always find it amazing, whether it's fiber or starch. When we study the ingredients in depth, it always comes back to nature. It always comes back to natural ingredients, whether potato, corn, rice, wheat, right? But it also always comes back to plants being very, very smart, because starch is basically the way that plants store energy. Plants need energy just like me and you. We need energy, and we eat carbohydrates to have energy. So just like for human beings, but originally starch is a way that the plants can store energy in the form of glucose molecules arranged in different ways, right? So plants have starch granules inside that they can that when they need energy, they can just use the enzymes to cut those molecules into small glucose units and get energy.
That means that this works like that on the plants and also with us, no? That means that when we are eating a cake or a bread with a starch inside, our body is going to cut these links in order to have glucose to survive and to
exactly.
live.
Think about when you're sick, and the thing that even whether it's in Spain or in Poland, the thing that our parents or grandparents would give us to eat would be like sort of a rice porridge. Why rice porridge? Rice is also abundant in starch, and actually when you cook it and you see the liquid, right, like the liquid becomes thick, and it's the amylose molecules leaking from the rice grains, and you have this thick porridge. Actually, it is easy on the stomach. The digestion is not that complicated because our body is capable of cutting it into glucose molecules and getting energy. So this is how we recuperate from any sickness. So this is just a proof of like of starch applied in a very simple way in our daily life, not only in pastry. So just like we said, starch or starch granules actually are composed of two types of molecules. We always have amylose and amylopectin. The two molecules make up starch, and they are different. They are composed of glucose molecules, but one amylose are glucose molecules arranged in a linear way. I think we can show you the graphic so it is easier to understand the difference between amylose and amylopectin. So these are the two types of molecules that we find in starch. Okay, amylose, linear chain of glucose molecules, and amylopectin, it has this very nice structure of like a coral, right? It makes us think of something like or a branch or a tree branch, right? So this branched, it has this branched structure, but they are both composed of glucose molecules linked together. They are just organized in a different way.
And what is the difference, Adrianna, between amylose and amylopectin in a product?
So there's always, like in a starch that we buy, whether it's corn or potato starch, right? They all contain both amylose and amylopectin, but in a different ratio. Right,
that means it depends. The starch that we are going to use, no, from potato, from corn, will be different percentage.
Exactly, of amylose or amylopectin.
And
typically,
this will give us different aspects to the texture, to the recipe.
Exactly. In general, if we take, for an example, wheat starch, the starch that we find in regular flour, we have more or less 25% of amylose to 75% of amylopectin, right? But then, depending on starch origin, for example, we can have, and the plant variety also, we can have long grain rice, short grain rice, right? Regular corn, waxy corn. We can have different types of potatoes. So depending on not only of the original tuber, let's say, but also on the specific variety of this plant, a cereal or a tuber, we will have variations. So there are starches with 18% of amylose, 15% of amylose, 30% of amylose, right? And on the extreme, we have waxy, so-called waxy starches from waxy maize or waxy potato varieties that contain 99%, about 99% amylopectin. Why do we put so much stress on amylose and amylopectin? I can imagine that when you hear it for the first time, maybe you are familiar with both of these molecules, but when you hear it for the first time, it's a little overwhelming, like to understand, why do I need to know it? I just buy my potato starch or corn starch. Just like you said, Jordi, one molecule has one properties, another has another one. So depending on the ratio, the functional properties of our ingredient will change, and we will later explain this. But one thing that I would like you to have very, very clear is amylose helps us create gels, and amylopectin is an amazing thickener. So we always, due to the ratio of amylose to amylopectin, we always have the thickening, but depending on whether we have more or less amylose, maybe our starch is not capable of gelling. So this is very, very important, especially once we get to discuss the baked products and how important the gelling property of starch is in them. So let's maybe also just go through those examples that we have here on the table. I don't know what types of starch are you working with, whether you just work with potato starch or whether you work with corn starch mostly. I think these are the two most used starches.
I think so.
Right?
I agree with you.
I used to think that maybe it depends on that people tend to choose potato starch or corn starch depending on where they live.
Because, for example, in Spain, we use a lot of corn starch. We know only maicena, we call here, and it's corn starch. Potato starch is really rare to find recipes in Spain that they use potato starch. And, for example, I have friends in France that they use both. I see a lot of French chefs that they use a lot of potato starch, and we are not used to use potato starch. And even on the supermarket, it's easier in France, potato starch and corn starch. And here, in general, you can buy only corn starch.
In Poland, I think as well, nowadays, probably in any big supermarket, you find both. But I remember that potato starch used to be more popular. I think it's because we have more potatoes, so it also makes sense. But these are potato starch and corn starch, I think, are the two varieties that are most popular, regardless of where we live. And later we can have tapioca starch, which comes from the cassava plant. We have kuzu, which is Japanese arrowroot starch. We can also have rice starch, and of course, not to forget, in regular flour we have wheat starch. So those are basically the most typical examples of starch. But starch can be classified not only depending on its origin, but also on the properties it has, or on whether it was modified or not. So let's talk a little bit about that. Here on the right, on this side, we have the examples of what we call native starch. Native starch is starch that hasn't been modified, okay? So it has exactly the properties as when it was extracted from the plant and processed, right, and turned. It was turned into this somehow refined powder, but it keeps the exact same properties. They are intact. On the other hand, we have what we call modified starches, and nowadays, every time they are becoming more and more important, because here we only have two examples. But Jordi, if we were to ask for like a big starch manufacturer, he could maybe send us 20 or 30 different starches, modified with enzymes, modified by hydrolysis, modified chemically, modified physically. It would really be another webinar or two to explain all the modifications. But what we want to explain is, why do we do
modify
this? Why do we modify starch, right? Why don't
it sounds not good, because when you see modified cornstarch, for example, you think this is not. It seems not natural, no. But at the end, what we do is just to adapt the products that we are using. For example, have the capacity to freeze and thaw recipes like pastry cream, for example. If we work with native starches, we cannot freeze, and when we are working with modified starches, we can freeze without any problem, and we have a perfect texture. No, and this, I think that even if we are doing things that we can say that are not they don't sound natural at all. We need this kind of products because at the end, all the final products, we need to adapt to the new necessities, and we need this kind of modifications, no?
I agree with you. Maybe the word modified, right? We start thinking, oh, maybe it's genetically modifying corn starch. No, it has nothing to do with this type of modification. It's just improving the functionality of native starch. So just to give you two examples, right, that we have here. One is a modified pre-gelatinized potato starch. The only difference between this potato starch and this potato starch is that in order to act well, the native potato starch needs water and heat, and we have to cook it to a certain degree, and there's still keep mixing, right, to obtain this viscous, this thick liquid, this thickening property of potato starch. Whereas here, this starch has been already pre-gelatinized, which means the starch granules were already put in water, heated up, they swollen. They got swollen in the process, then they were dried again, turned into powder again, which means that we can use this starch at room temperature. We don't need to heat it up again for cooking. This is basically what is...
that means, Adrianna, that we can blend directly No, in a recipe, just blend, and we will have like the same properties like cooking the recipe, no?
Exactly. An example that comes to my mind is instant puddings, right?
Okay.
You can have,
Yes.
you can do a regular pudding with starch, or by cooking milk and then adding starch, and this is how you get your pudding. Or you buy those instant puddings where already, because it's pre-gelatinized, for example, you just put water or milk, you mix it, and you have already your pudding ready. So this is one example of a modification. It's not a chemical modification, it's a physical modification, just heating up the starch, making the granules bigger so that they don't need this two-step process, right? That the water and the temperature, and then they can act much faster. So today we will talk a little bit about this, about when would we recommend using native starch, and when do we opt for the modified starch, and why? Because I think this is what is most useful for the pastry chefs. So moving on, we also see that you are already sending us your answers. You are telling us what types of starch you're working with. So thank you very much for that. And Adrianna was asking about the properties of amylose and amylopectin. Don't worry, we will keep going back to this question, because it's really important. Okay. Which of the starches are the lowest? Very interesting questions. Let's do. We're very happy because we love getting questions. So let's see if we can go on with the presentation, and meanwhile you can type your questions, and for sure at the end we will dedicate at least 30 minutes for your questions. So if you have questions, maybe some of them will be resolved during the masterclass, and if not, just type them in, and we will answer them at the end of this masterclass. So moving on and going back to the role of starch in pastry, Jordi, personally, what were you using starch for in
where?
Yes, what were you, or what are you? Well, now I know it for many things, but what did you use starch for?
And what kind of products?
Exactly.
No, for example, pastry cream is the first product that I started to use so many years ago, starch. Then, for example, in sauces, baking dough, for example, in baking dough is really important. For example, when you want sponges or cakes vegan, became really, really important, because when we have proteins from the eggs that we are going to explain now, it's not give us a structure, but when we remove the proteins from the eggs, for example, the starch became really, really important. Now here in that recipe, we have eggs in both recipes, but in these kinds of recipes, the more you reduce the proteins, the more you reduce the gluten, the more you need, for example, starches. No, and this kind of recipes, in this kind of recipes, we are using starches, and also for mousses now, because there is examples when we don't want to use gelatin. For example, in a mousse, we can use, for example, a work team of 2 ingredients that are agar-agar and starch. And agar-agar and starch, they are not so good for the freezing and thaw process, but for example, when they work together, we can have a good result on the recipes. We can have mousses without
vegan mousses, you mean, right?
Even vegan or not vegan, because in some countries they don't like to use gelatin, for example, from the animal production, even if they use eggs on the recipe. And just for remove gelatin to the recipes, we can explain that we can use these 2 ingredients, starch, working on team with agar-agar, and if we use even modified cornstarch, it will work much better for the freezing and thaw process than if we work with native starches. No, but even using agar-agar and native starches, we can set like we do with gelatin, for example, a mousse, a mango mousse, for example, or raspberry mousse, and we will have a really similar texture, and we will avoid the use of animal gelatin on the recipes, even if we use, for example, eggs.
This is a very interesting example, right, of those new applications of starches. I don't think starch was used in mousses back, 20 years ago, but like nowadays we find all these new applications for starch, and also with this big variety of ingredients that we have available, right? All of them have a little distinct properties. So I think that if you look at this, and also one graphic that we want to show you, what is the role of starch in pastry, right? We have starch that was primarily originally was used as a thickener. And this is the example that we mentioned, the pastry cream, pastry sauces, or even some fruit fillings in pies, right? For example, this is, I think, very typical for in the United States, right? That you make tarts with pies with lots of fruit. But if you use fresh fruit, exactly, you cannot have this fruit leaking water all over during baking. So you actually use starch to give it to capture the free water, right, and make some sort of semi-liquid thickened pie filling.
It's like when we use pectins, but in an easier way, we can say, no, because it's easier to buy starches than pectins, for example. And in this kind of, in the history of pastry, in this kind of countries that they produce a lot of fillings with fruits, we use fruit, they use fruits, sugar, and then one option is pectin. No, here, I think in Europe, the solution was to boil, I think, because when you see the ancient recipes, you see that they boil, and they concentrate, the recipes in order to have the texture, but it's a smart thinking, I think, a smartest, to add starch, and like that, you just boil a rice to until 85, 90 degrees, your starch, give us a structure, and we don't need to boil or use pectin to have stability on this kind of recipes.
That's right. So we start with thickening, and this is, I think, something that comes to our mind. Like we hear starch, we say, okay, it's a thickener, that's it. But then we don't associate it that much, neither with gluten-free baking nor plant-based yogurts, right, or creaminess. So it's interesting to see what the graphic that you can see right now, right, to discuss starch not only as a thickener. It's an amazing texturizing agent, which is both a thickener but also a gelling agent, right? It also can give us structure in baked doughs, both gluten and gluten-free. So you see all this variety of the roles that starch can have in pastry, right? And I think even here, I forgot to add, we could make another arrow from thickening and also, right, building creaminess, what we said before, sure. Right? I mean, through thickening, starch is also helping us build creaminess. So, and through thickening and gelation, it's helping us to build structure in baked doughs. And one last role of starch that you have here is moisture absorption. This is like a very easy example. Is starch is often added to some powders so that it absorbs moisture, that the powders don't have lumps. For example, baking powder, right, can have a very small addition of starch just to conserve those products better. And today we will focus mostly on thickening, gelation, and how to build structure, how starch helps us build structure in baked doughs. But we want you to keep in mind that this really wide variety of applications, of possible applications of starch in your pastry or bakery products, because it's a very versatile ingredient, and by knowing very well different types of starches, you can improve your pastry creams. For example, starch, like thickening, can be done with any type of starch. But what happens? Is it the same to make a pastry cream with potato starch and rice starch or tapioca starch or kuzu?
It's not
We
exactly
have
the
tried.
same.
We have
Yes.
tried because for our extended online B concept pastry course, we were developing some pastry cream recipes, right? And I remember that, for example, kudzu gave us this amazing shine,
It was
right?
amazing. Yes,
It's a
incredible.
very expensive ingredient, the Japanese arrowroot starch kudzu,
Was a vegan cream with chocolate
exactly, we made
for a roll cake and for
exactly.
a cinnamon roll was amazing. This
Yes.
why just changing the starch that we are using in exactly the same recipe. I remember that was even the same percentage. We did the recipe at home because we were on the quarantine,
During the
and
quarantine, yes.
we saw completely different. No,
Yes, that it has that beautiful sheen, this luster, right? And that, for example, we don't have with potato starch or
No.
with tapioca starch or with rice starch. So each starch does have its unique properties when it comes to the temperature that we need to work at, when it comes to the way, if it gives us translucent, right, like transparent gels, let's say, or whether they are more like opaque, the texture that it gives us in cake, the crumb, or for example, pastry cream with potato starch sometimes is considered a little more grainy or lumpy than with rice starch or tapioca starch, just because potato starch granules are much bigger in size. So it's so those little differences.
That means, Adrianna, that even if we see the same texture, no, and
exactly, it looks like white pie.
we can see that are exactly the same for us. We know that the size of the molecules are completely different.
That's exactly how it is, Jordi. Like we would really have to see it under a microscope to understand that no starch, like starch was not created equal. There are many varieties of starch, and nowadays, the more we get to know them, the better, let's say, the better texture we will have, whether in our sauces or pastry creams or in our cakes. So this is to talk a little bit in general about the role of starch in pastry. We have talked about it until here, and now slowly we want to move on to what is the main topic of our free masterclass, meaning starch in cakes. Okay? And let's start, Jordi. I wanted us to examine. I wanted us to talk a little bit about what do we need in order to make, right? What techniques, what pastry techniques do we need in order to build a cake structure?
I think at the beginning, when you start to think in the recipes, we have to know that we need to understand the ingredients. This is a really important part in order to know to understand the role of each ingredient in our recipe, but then there is the techniques. And the techniques that we are using in pastry, we can find in a mousse, we can find in a ganache, we can find in a creamy, but also we can find in cakes and sponges and crunchy doughs, like, for example, cookies, no? And we can say that we have like three, four techniques that we are using, and we can say that in pound cakes we are using, for example, thickening, no, because we are using thickening through the ingredients that we are using. This kind of recipes contains a lot of dry ingredients and not too much water. We will see when we analyze the cakes and we compare one to the other one, we will see that can change between 70 to 80% of dry extract and 20% of water on the recipes. That means that all this dry extract that we will have naturally present in all the ingredients that we are using is going to give us a thickening effect, and this is going to give us viscosity on the texture of our cake, of our cake pound. Then it depends what kind of dry extract. For example, if we have starches, we know that the starches, they absorb a lot of water, more than, for example, almond meal or rice flour, and it will depend the percentage of these ingredients that we are going to use. We will have, even if we have the same quantity of water, we will change the viscosity that we have on the recipe. Then if we move to another technique that is really important in pastry, that we use in a lot of recipes, we use in a crème anglaise, we use in a pastry cream, no, because pastry cream is thickening, no, and gelation from the starches, but then from the casein and egg yolks that contains lecithin, we have emulsification, no? And emulsification is really also important in this kind of textures, no, of cake pounds, because give us, for example, better structure, better shelf life, because when we catch, no, the water with the fats that we have on the recipe, for the water is more difficult to move outside of the texture and keep the texture better during more time. And then through the emulsification, we have flexibility. No, there is something. I don't know if this is the example more easy to understand, but I have two recipes in mind. Like for example, at aquas and roll cake. No, the aquas, we don't have emulsification. We have just egg whites that we whip with sugar, and we add, for example, almond meal, almond flour, and sometimes starch, sometimes flour, and don't have any process of emulsification. And this kind of texture like the aquas are not flexible. In general, they break really easy, no? But then we have another kind of texture, like for example, roll cakes, roll sponge for roll cakes that we use, and this kind of textures are, in general, we are using emulsification, and emulsification gives us flexibility. We have the molecules more attached one to the other ones through the emulsification of technique, and we can say that we have more flexibility. That means that, in general, one cake pound that has emulsification and the right process of emulsification, the texture will be different than one cake, for example, pound that we are not using any emulsifier. For example, if we want a crumbly texture, not very well organized, just that you cut, and it's really easy to break it and to have small pieces, for example, because this can be a problem. But sometimes it's something that we want. In general, we don't have to use emulsification. That means that we have to remove all the egg yolks that we have on the recipe, or even just mix it not too much in order to have, for example, the eggy taste, but not too much emulsion capacity. And then if we move to another techniques, we have aeration. I think that everybody understands that we have aeration in this kind of cakes, sponges. We have aeration. Sometimes
pancakes as well. We have our aeration, not that much, right? Every cake and every dough will have a different amount of aeration. But even pound cakes do have air inside due to the method, the preparation method, and also due to the presence of the baking powder, basically.
And also for the when we whip eggs, and when we think in aeration, Adrianna, we can say that is a huge difference. For example, imagine that we have a basic recipe that contains 1% of baking powder, to say something, and we have the eggs. If we over whip the eggs, what happens in general is that the pound cake is going to grow up really fast, because we will have more air on the recipe that we whip it than the one that we didn't whip it at all, and will be exactly the same recipe, but the result will be completely different. And what happens is that when we have a quantity of X quantity of baking powder and whip up, we introduce air in a recipe. What happens is, in general, this kind of doughs, they grow up really fast, because when we introduce on the oven, we are going to heat up the dough. This air bubbles that we have inside, they are going to increase the volume. The cake dough is going to increase. But if we don't have enough quantity of starch, for example, they collapse, and at the same speed that they grow up, they fall.
They start to act like a souffle, right? Yes. Like rise, but then collapse.
Yes, in this kind of recipes, we can, thinking in this direction, we can say that in a recipe that we are going to whip, the starch will be really important, more than in a recipe that we are not going to whip. And the proteins also will be really important. Why? Because starch and proteins, they will help us to stabilize this structure when on the cooking process we are just we are fixing the proteins from the eggs, and starch will give us this capacity to keep the structure. And then we move to the gelation capacity. In general, this kind of recipes contains egg proteins, contains gelatinization of starches, and then we have gluten. In general recipes, we have gluten, and gluten has two proteins, gliadins and glutenins, that helps us to create this structure. That means that in general, in this kind of recipes, we are using 4 techniques.
That's right.
In general, that means it depends what kind of texture we want to achieve. We are going to work
more with one technique, or like just like you said, introduce more air, so focus more on the aeration. Or if we need a more compact, dense texture, because maybe we're going even a pound cake, even though it's fluffy and a little spongy, it's more compact than a sponge cake, obviously. So depending on the type of cake we are making, the type of dough that we are making, right, we will put more emphasis on one or the other as far as the techniques go. And I think it's also worth mentioning here, if we look at gelation, that we mentioned gluten proteins, right? The gluten network, the 2 proteins that we find in gluten, they make this amazing network that is able to trap air bubbles during the fermentation and during the baking process, right? And it's elastic, so it allows the dough to expand. And then because when the temperature, like in the temperature, the dough sets, right? So the bubbles are, the air bubbles are trapped inside. And to this we owe an amazing texture of bread, basically, but also in many doughs we're also using this capacity of gluten network. But there's also egg proteins, just like you mentioned, and also starch. What happens now, if we now move on from this classic cakes or classic baked products to gluten-free baked products, right? What we take out? We don't take out the aeration, we don't take out the emulsification or the thickening, right? We only, basically what we modified is that we will no longer have gluten network. And how does it impact our texture or different pastry textures, Jordi, not being able to count on gluten-free network? I know that basically you haven't been using gluten or very little gluten since maybe more than 10 years. So like, what was the biggest problem in the beginning when you switched to gluten-free flours? What was missing from the recipes?
Yes, I think that because the people ask me a lot of times, they ask a lot of times to us that how they can remove gluten from the recipes, flours in general that contains gluten from the recipes. And I always say not the same. For me, for example, recipes like bread, brioche, croissants, we really need gluten network. Here we need these proteins that give us the capacity to have a texture that will structure the air bubbles that we create on the fermentation process, like the bread, and will give us the capacity to create a nice texture. Because in general, what's happened today is that on the market they love fluffy textures, not really light textures on breads, on brioches, and this kind of thing. And when we work with this kind of recipes, when we want to move to a gluten-free recipe, like for example, the gluten-free bread that we have in our website on the blog, we have a gluten-free bread that is really good, really interesting recipe. And in this kind of recipes, the more the gluten is necessary, the more we need the starches. That means that in this bread that we did the recipe, we added starches in order to have something similar to this kind of texture. But when we move to a pastry recipes, for example, sponges, crunchy textures, sablés, in this kind of recipes, that gluten is It's
not as important, right? Especially if we're talking about sablé. In sablé, you actually try to limit the gluten by coating the flour in fat, because like this gluten network will not develop, because what you want is a crunchy texture. You don't want this elasticity. You don't want your sablé dough to expand in the oven, which would happen if the gluten network forms and traps some air inside. So actually, or the cookies, just like you mentioned, right? We don't, sometimes we really want the shape of the cookies. We don't want a cakey cookie. We want just a
flat,
crunchy, flat cookie. So in this case, whether it's very easy to substitute gluten-free flours for a regular flour for gluten-free flours, and we don't have to think too much, and we don't have to preoccupy ourselves with whether we need to put now starches, or I think it's much more difficult to substitute eggs in those recipes, right? But like gluten containing flour for gluten-free flour is not a problem. But today we took a case, just like you said, Jordi, in bread, it's really essential. It's really hard to make a gluten-free bread without counting on starch. Like if you have recipes that work, that are fluffy and airy and do not contain any type of starch, please let us know, because we'd love to learn. But I think that in specifically in bread, where gluten network is so important, we need to replace the gluten network with another type of network or matrix, and this is what starch allows us to do. Because why? Coming back to your question, Adrian, like amylopectin, those two molecules being in the starch granules, they swell, and later they also start to, so already by swelling, they limit the movement either of water or of air bubbles. But later also they start to, the amylose chains start to leak from the starch granules, and they start forming bonds between each other, making also a three-dimensional network. And this network is also capable. It's not as elastic, or it doesn't have the same, it will never have exactly the same properties as gluten network, because the molecules are different, because the situation is different, the conditions are different. But it also creates a network, and this is this network that allows us to recreate the spongy the sponge cakes or pound cakes, or even make us fluffy gluten-free breads. So this is the role of starch in gluten-free baking, to replace the gluten network as far as the structure for the air bubbles is concerned, right? We really need to, in order to have a texture that has air inside, that is aerated texture, we need some sort of matrix that will allow us to trap the air bubbles while the other components of the cake set in the oven, right, during heating. So in the case of gluten doughs, it's the gluten that sets. In the case of cakes, it will be both the egg proteins and the starch that is present, that will set the cake in the oven.
And the extreme, Adriana, the extreme, we can say that, because we can say in the middle, this is not really important in order to have the structure. This we have on the middle. In the other side, we have, for example, vegan sponges, where we remove the proteins, and the starches became really important. No, if we want to have a really perfect structure and we remove eggs from the recipe, the only way, or one of the useful, and better ways in order to replace this kind of jellification, we can say, thickening on the recipe, is to use starches. And we discovered that using different starches, we have different effects, like we will explain now in these two recipes.
That's exactly right, and so with this last graphic, right, we want to show you a little bit what is the role of starch, in how starch can act in gluten-free cakes. So it's very present as far as the gelation is concerned, what we just finished explaining, right, it actually allows us to have this network trapping air bubbles inside and being responsible for the airy cake texture. But it also helps aeration in a less direct way, meaning that while the starch granules swell, right, and they are getting bigger, they are absorbing water, and later in the oven, this water turns into vapor, which also allows us to create other air bubbles inside, right? And like this, they also indirectly contribute to aeration, and of course, they contribute to the thickening. We cannot have a liquid dough in the oven. Usually doesn't do very well. A very liquid dough in the oven, right? And when we don't have gluten, sometimes the depending also on the water catching capacity that the flour has, right? Sometimes we lack this body, this viscosity in the dough, and actually starch helps us with this one as well, allowing the cake to not only rise, right, with the swelling of the starch granules, with the action of the baking powder, right, but then later not to collapse. That's what we've been trying to explain, right? Starch really helps us maintain the cake structure, and later is responsible for the nice cake texture by building this support for right, by making the dough have more body, be more viscous, by helping with the aeration, by replacing the gluten network. So it really has those different functions, and as a result is very helpful when we make the change from gluten regular flours to gluten-free flours. I'm trying to see if we didn't forget, or if we didn't forget anything. I see that already many very interesting questions, and I think, Jordi, you will like some of them because they're very health-oriented as well, and that's something we wanted to comment on while finishing. So don't worry, all these questions about the glycemic index or about the health aspect of starches, we will tackle them at the end. But because the theme of the masterclass is like how to make those gluten-free recipes, we do need to move on to a practical case and explain exactly how do we use starches in our gluten-free cake recipes, for example. So before we move on to a practical case, yes. Jordi, yes. I think we have something that we want to share with all of you. We would like to invite you to just watch a short video of dedicated to our extended online B-Concept pastry course, because that's something that we also worked. Now it's been almost more than a year that we've been working on it. We've already have 3 editions launched, and now the 4th and the 5th edition this autumn are approaching. And in this course, we talk not only about, just like today, we talk about starch, like in much more detail. We talk about every possible pastry ingredient, the molecular composition, the functional properties. And so we just wanted to share this with you, the fruit of our work of the whole year. And before we move on to the practical case and the cake recipe that we have today, we will show you a short video focused on the online course.
Hi, I'm Jordi Bordas, World Pastry Champion and the creator of the B-Concept method. Together with my team, I have created a unique online pastry course. Everything started when I was 14 years old, working in my parents' bakery. With time, I discovered that pastry was my language, my way to communicate and express myself. With a lot of training and experience under my belt, in 2011, I won the World Pastry Championship. This was a very special moment that became a turning point in my life. After becoming World Pastry Champion, I realized I wasn't free creating my recipes. and I started following a healthy lifestyle. But my recipes did not reflect that. I understood that the world has changed, but pastry remained the same. I started studying each recipe. I needed the freedom to create my recipes, and I needed a method. I spent a lot of time investigating ingredients and techniques, looking for answers to my questions. And this was the beginning of the big concept method, a method to create healthier, lighter, and tastier recipes from scratch. In 2015, I opened my pastry school in Viladecans, where we have taught the method to more than 1,000 students. In 2020, we opened our R&D center and created this unique online course. Now you can take this course.
We introduce you to the online extended version of the Big Concept course. In this course, composed of 4 different parts, you will learn how to formulate and create your own pastry recipes. In the first part, you will learn everything about water, fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, the molecules that make up all our ingredients. Knowing their physicochemical and functional properties will give you the knowledge that you need to work with any pastry ingredient. Through the second part, you will be able to master emulsification, aeration, thickening, and gelation, 4 techniques that are essential for creating perfectly balanced pastry textures. In the third part, you will learn how to formulate recipes using the Big Concept method. We will show you over 30 practical cases and give you the keys to create healthier, lighter, and tastier recipes. In the last part, we will show you step by step how to execute a collection of pastry creations. We will give you many practical tips so you can apply them in your daily work. The course includes more than 40 hours of videos, a theory book of over 300 pages, and countless recipes. You will also be able to participate in forums and live webinars to solve all your doubts and interact with other students. You will put your knowledge to test with different assignments and self-evaluation tests, and by completing them, you will earn your training certificate. But don't worry, we will guide you and help you all along the way.
If you love pastry and want to understand all the processes and reactions behind your recipes, this is the course you have been waiting for.
It is a perfect course for any pastry chef wanting to share their values through their creations.
Maybe you want to redesign and adapt your recipes so that they fit better your customers' needs.
Or you need to balance your recipes, resolving any stability, texture, or taste issues.
And if you are looking for a course to learn how to save time and resources, look no more.
To take the course, you only need a device with internet connection, pen, paper, and a desire to learn.
Throughout this course, we will give you all the tools that you need to become independent at creating your own pastry collection.
Master the Big Concept method and tap into your infinite creative potential.
You will be surprised at what you can achieve once you complete this course.
Come and join us.
We hope you enjoyed this little intermission in our free masterclass, that you enjoyed the video that we wanted to share with you. And now we will move on to studying a practical case. We will analyze a pound cake recipe and how we adapted it, not only to gluten-free recipes, but also to some of our other needs. And we also will take time to answer your questions during the short break. We were looking at the questions. We are very, very excited. These are very, very interesting and valid questions. So just please stay with us, and we promise we hope to be able to answer all of them.
Just let's go to explain this case that we have one classic recipe, one recipe created in our
philosophy
of our philosophy, that we reduced the sugar, for example, we removed the gluten, and we started to work with different starches, and we are going to explain what each starch is, what characteristics of these two different starches that we are using in this cake they are doing. In classic recipe, we have eggs. Eggs give us emulsion capacity for the egg yolks that we have inside. We have egg whites that contains proteins, and this will give us gelation technique on this cake. We have sugar, a lot of sugar, 24% of sugar, and this is something that we are working in this recipe that we created from the concept philosophy, that we tried to reduce the sugar because it's something that
as much as possible.
Everybody is asking about less sugar products or sugar-free products, and for this reason, in that recipe, on the concept gluten-free cake recipe that we created, we worked with coconut sugar and working just with 14-15% of sugar in order to reduce the glycemic index. We can say that we have in this cake dough, in this cake pound, and the impact that we have with these sugars on the health parameters for the people. That means that on the classic recipe, we have 10% more of sugar. Then we have flour, gluten
regular, yes, regular cake flour, right? Which doesn't have as much gluten as bread flour, because there's also difference as far as the gluten protein content is concerned. It can be 10%, or it can be almost 14%. So depending on the flour, but typically in a pound cake, we chose like a classic French pound cake as an example. We would use a cake, right? White refined cake flour. So on one side we have white refined cake flour, and on the other side we have whole rice flour. And I think it's first of all, it's also interesting to mention that sometimes we still forget where the starch is in our recipes, because even here we do have starch, right?
For sure.
Whole rice flour also contains starch. So it's true that when calculating the amount of starch, because I saw one question about the amount of starch in gluten-free recipes. So if we looked at the ingredients, we could think that it's only the, let's say, 8 or no, it's actually 7 point something percent that we have, a little over 7% that we added. But we have to think that of the 24, almost 25% of flour that we have, of the whole rice flour, a significant amount will also be rice starch. So it's also something to think of, that many times we think, oh, maybe this recipe does not contain starch. It's gluten-free, but it doesn't contain starch. Well, it might still contain starch that is kind of hidden in the flours that we use, because gluten-free flours are not necessarily starch-free flours. The only starch-free flours would be the fake flours like almond flour, hazelnut flour, right?
Even in this kind
and even in the exactly
flour,
sometimes exactly. For example, chestnut flour does contain a lot of starch, because chestnut, as a nut, as a fruit, contains a lot of starch. So also keep in mind that, because sometimes maybe when you're looking or you're worried about or you're thinking about which starch, which flour, right? We can also play with that, choosing different flours, and they have different starch content.
Then we have butter on the classic recipe, cut card, that we have butter, and butter, we can say that it's a mix of fats and water. We have
an emulsion, basically.
An emulsion. Yes, we have around 14-16% of water, and the rest is almost everything is fat. And inside these fats, there is saturated fatty acids are the bigger quantity, and then we have unsaturated. But in general, we have a lot of saturated fatty acids, because when we think in butter, we think in a fat that is really strong, hard structure. Like if we compare to the olive oil, for example, that is completely liquid at 20 degrees, we can understand that there is a different kind of fatty acids and different composition, and also this gives us a different texture on the recipe. And then we have baking powder, aeration. We can say that butter gives us a structure, give us creaminess, we can say, to the, even if we are speaking in this kind of textures. But also in that recipe, we have aeration technique that comes from the mixing process of the butter and sugar. When we mix butter and sugar, this will help us to introduce air inside of the recipe, but also the baking powder that we are using, this is going to give us aeration on the recipe, and this is going to give us fluffy texture. No? Like we can see here that we have a space between the molecules because we are using this working between the eggs, the sugar with the butter, and the baking powder that we have on the recipe. And if we see on the big concept gluten-free cake butter, we change it for coconut oil, no? In order to have a recipe without dairy products, and we are using coconut oil. But when we change butter for another fat in a similar composition of saturated and unsaturated fatty acids, we have to think that butter contains water, and this water we have to adjust to add to the recipe. That means that we cannot change 24% of butter to 24% of coconut oil, because coconut oil doesn't contain water, and we have to calculate of this 24.8% of butter how much fatty acids we have inside and how much water, and change this on the recipe. And for this reason, on the big concept gluten-free cake recipe, we have coconut oil, 19.67% of coconut oil. That is the fat, more or less, that comes from the butter. And then we added just water in order to adjust the recipe, because thinking also
we added some additional water because of starch.
For this reason, because of starch need water to be hydrated, and also we have to think that we are adding an ingredient that has much more capacity to catch water, like for example almond meal. And the more we add this kind of ingredients like starches, the more we need to increase the water on the recipe. In order to have
it goes for starch, for fiber, right? Anytime we add the dry extract with a water catching capacity, we will need.
Yes, will be exactly the same. Like if we add, for example, coconut flour. No, it's. I remember the first time that you say me, Jordi, we can use coconut flour, no? And okay, let's go to see. And we prepared it. I think that was a crumble, and we move it. No, it was a cake. We move it one recipe to that recipe, exactly the same quantity. And coconut flour contains even, I think,
43% of fiber.
No,
so it usually catches, like, it has 4 times the water catching capacity of regular flour. So you cannot.
In that recipe was like, what's happened here? No, because it was like crumbly texture. No, it was not a smoothie texture, and this
very
was
dry
because no fiber was absorbing. No? That means that each ingredient that we are changing, the more ingredients we add to the recipe that has more water catchment capacity, the more we need to increase water on the recipe. For this reason, if we see the parameters dry extract on the page number 6, we can see that on the classic recipe we have 81% of dry extract, and then on the recipe that we move it to the concept gluten-free cake, we have 75%, and this is because we have more ingredients that they are going to catch water. In this case, we have potato starch and modified cornstarch, and for this reason, we included the water. No.
One thing that I want to go back to, Jordi, is our choice of starches, because I think, right, this is important. Like you explained perfectly, like why, for example, why we had to rebalance the recipe when adding starches, right? But like taking just a step backwards, let's discuss why the choice of these particular starches, right? When you make a change from regular flours to gluten-free flours, just like we said, you can choose from tapioca starch, cornstarch, potato starch, rice starch, or even kuzu, which in cake I guess would be too expensive and I'm not sure if really called for, but you have this wide variety of ingredients. And then on the other hand, also you can have waxy cornstarch, you can have modified starches. So how do you know which starch works best for your gluten-free preparations? I hope it will not be too disappointing if I say that I really, and I think we really encourage you to try and make tests, because we have tried and we have gotten some interesting results, and some of them can be very well explained with the theory that we learned, right? So we can understand, for example, that starch with a higher amylose content, that is going back to the questions that were appearing in the beginning of the masterclass, right? Why do we need? What is the purpose of amylose, and what is the purpose of amylopectin? So starch with a high amylose content is able to create this network, to replace the gluten network, right? To mimic the role of gluten in our recipes. That's why it helps the gluten-free cakes to grow, to the granules not only swell, but later, after the swelling, the amylose molecules create this network and trap those little air bubbles even more, so that we have a fluffier and nicer cake texture. That's why when we're looking to replace a regular flour for a gluten-free flour, right, we'll choose our flour, but then we will also check for starch that has well, let's say at least 18, 20, or even 25% of amylose, because this will help the cake rise in the oven and have this nice structure. But what happens when we go for the highest, for the native starch with the highest amylose content? Like, for example, could be a potato starch, which sometimes can have up to 30% of amylose. It really helps the cake rise. The cake, upon baking, after baking, has a very nice texture. We eat it. We're so happy with our result. We said, okay, this is our recipe. Then we put the cake in the fridge to next day, I don't know, to put a filling or to decorate it or to glaze it, right? The next day we take out the cake from the fridge and it's a disaster. It's as hard as a rock. And even after coming back to room temperature, we can see that this nice texture that we have here, right? That it's really, we can see how it moves, how that it has elasticity, suddenly becomes very, very compact and hard, and we don't understand why. So the thing about amylopectin is, just like it helps us on one hand to replace gluten, to create a network that can capture air bubbles. On the other hand, the amylopectin molecules, this network is not stable. It's not stable over time. So as the hours go by, the amylopectin molecules from this network just start getting closer together and closer and closer, and slowly, like pushing out the air bubbles outside, right? And the texture becomes more dense and compact. If you think about it, this is exactly what happens in bread, even gluten bread, right? Like gluten-containing bread. You bake the bread, it's amazing, the texture, the taste, everything is amazing. You leave it out for a couple of hours, you come back, and it's so hard. And right, and it's really, it has a completely different texture. This is because the amylose, also present in wheat starch, in wheat flour, regular wheat flour, retrogrades, right? So the retrograding starch, retrogradation, is responsible for bread becoming stale within a couple of hours. In the case of cake, it doesn't happen over hours. It happens over days, we can say, but if we put it in the fridge, the process is accelerated. Exactly. So if we put it in the fridge, it will happen overnight as well. So that's a big problem if we want our cakes to have a filling, if we want to glaze them the next day, if we want to keep them in the fridge, right, and not outside, if we want to give them a longer shelf life in one way or another. So we have tried potato starch, and then we tried replacing it, like doing the same recipe with all of it, 45 grams potato starch. It was great, but when we put it in the fridge, it becomes more compact. Then we tried with cornstarch. The problem I have with cornstarch, Jordi, is that at this concentration, around 7-8%, I have the feeling that it's less compact, it's more moist, but it has this chewy, sticky, texture that I don't like. When we lower the concentration, it's quite okay, but depending on the concentration, it gives us this chewy, sticky, a little texture in the mouth. So that's how that's how we get to our choices, right? By trial and error, and also studying the properties of starches. So while studying the properties of starches, we came upon modified starches and their properties, right? So we found out that both cornstarch and potato starch, right, retrograde, and it's difficult to make a cake and then keep it in the fridge. But it happened the fastest retrogradation we have seen is with potato starch by far. So so I would probably only advise you to use only potato starch if your products are to be sold the same day. Then it's perfect, no problem at all, right? But if you want to store them in the fridge, do something with them the next day, or freeze them, unfreeze them, right? It's the starch retrogradation can be of amylose is really complicated. We tried the same recipe with tapioca starch. It also worked very, very nicely. But in order to prevent this the starch retrogradation effect of potato starch, we came upon this idea of combining two different starches. And actually, in this recipe, if we count the whole rice flour and the starch, exactly, and the starch we have here, we can say we already are counting on 3 different starches, right? So we combined the starch with high amylose content that allows our cake to rise in the oven and get bigger, with a starch that actually prevents, that is much higher in amylopectin, and actually is a modified starch that prevents syneresis and starch retrogradation. So it like delays starch retrogradation. So this is why we use modified cornstarch. This is the physically modified cornstarch, so treated with high temperatures, it's not a chemical modification, it's just a physical treatment to improve its functionality. And it actually worked quite well. So only by using 40% within this starch percentage, right? Using 40% of modified cornstarch and 60% of potato starch, we got a result that even after putting in the fridge overnight and taking it out and bringing it to room temperature, doesn't lose this nice, fluffy, a little moist, right? Doesn't lose the moisture. So this is an explanation of why this particular choice. It doesn't mean you cannot work with other starches. Actually, we encourage you to try different starches, precisely because each of them gives us a slight change in the texture or in the taste. Some of them have aftertaste, some of them have less aftertaste. This is the combination we found works for us. And it's also one of the combinations, let's say, in a lower range, because just like, I don't know who was commenting, sometimes the gluten-free recipes contain a lot of starch, yes, right? Like 30-40% of starch. So we didn't want that for health reasons, we didn't see the necessity to put so much starch.
At the end, here in that recipe, we are trying to make a healthier recipe also on the same way. We reduce sugar. It has not too much logic. No, if we remove sugar and we increase the starch, that the glycemic index is 100, no more even than sugar. No, that means that the starches that we add to the recipe at the end increases the glycemic index that we have on the product, because at the end these ingredients are molecules of glucose that the body has the capacity to cut and absorb really fast. And the way to reduce this effect is just add more fiber. No, in that recipe we have, like on the Catricarbon, we have 0.7 of fiber, but on the Big Concept gluten-free cake we have 1.62. But even we can add more fiber here by using, for example, inulin from chicory root that can help us by introducing 2, 3, 4, 5% of fiber to the disto, we will reduce the impact of the starches and the sugar that we are using, because always when we have fibers helps us to reduce the glycemic index that we have, to lower the glycemic index that we have on the final products.
Because the glycemic response will be much slower, exactly. So we won't have this glycemic peak like very fast, and then like the sharp fall, it will be more even. So it always helps, and it's always good to think. And I really like that many of you are thinking in this way and like are worried or preoccupied about the health aspect of the recipe. So we are as well. That's why cutting the sugar basically in half, and that's why we are also already thinking of how this recipe, like we made this, let's say, basic recipe for the purpose of this masterclass, but we're already thinking how can we tweak it again and again to bring more sugar, but we wanted maybe to use ingredients that you all have more or less available, like in any supermarket. Inulin or oligofructose, you have to look a little more in the health stores or in order to find
also we have other fibers.
But we have exactly
psyllium husk, for example. Psyllium husk is an example of fiber that we are using, for example, on the gluten-free breads, to have thickening effect on the recipe. No? And it's a natural fiber, really good and really easy to find everywhere in the world. No? And before to start for the questions, Adrianna, because I think that we are arriving to the final explanations, I want to ask to you, what is the way to reduce or to delay the retrogradation of the starch that we have?
That's an excellent question, Jordi, because actually there's many factors. We always have to think cakes are very complex structures, and just like, for example, the temperature at which the starch will set is different depending on how much sugar we put in our cakes, right? It's all connected. Also, starch retrogradation depends on the amount of fat and sugar. That's why bread, which practically doesn't contain neither fat nor sugar, will retrograde almost instantly, like within hours, and the cake with a lot of butter will keep at least like 24 hours before it starts to retrograde, right?
That means that more fat we have from the butter, from oils, from any kind of fat, and more sugar also. The more sugar we have, the more we will delay this process.
Because basically they interfere. They don't let the amylose molecules, right, to get together, get back and squeeze the air out of this network. They are there in the middle, and like also they compete with starch for the water. For example, sugars compete with starch for the water. So not all the water is available for the starch. So there are lots of complex mechanisms through which, right, starch retrogradation can be delayed. One of them in our case was using modified starch, using a part of modified starch with a higher amylopectin content that wouldn't allow amylose to retrograde that quickly, or would interfere with the retrogradation of amylose. But also, like you said, we kept the high percentage of fat. We could go lower, but we decided also to keep it just for texture, for the purpose of keeping the shelf life, right, of the cake longer, etc. One last comment regarding the way to introduce fiber. I don't know if we've mentioned already, right? We could also substitute, when we were talking about coconut flour, right? We can substitute the whole rice flour with a small part of coconut flour, always when we remember to compensate it with water, but also almond flour, hazelnut flour, right? For example, here we have 150 grams of whole rice flour. You can perfectly well make this cake again with 100 grams of whole rice flour and 50 grams of almond flour. And if the almond flour is with the skin, like even better, it has higher fiber amount. And like this, you are linking starch with fiber, which is much more beneficial for health than just using starch on its own.
And also, if we want to soften this texture on the become gluten-free, even on the classic recipe, we can play with butter or with coconut oil and other oils, like, for example, sunflower oil, olive oil in a percentage in order to avoid the recrystallization of the saturated fatty acids that we have in both recipes, and like that to make softer texture at 20 degrees. No, that means that, for example, on the classic recipe, if we change this, it's just an example, this 4.8% of butter, and we move this percentage with olive oil, we will have a softer texture, and exactly the same like if we do this change on the concept gluten-free cake. No, that means that the starches are important in order to achieve the texture that we want when we work with gluten-free recipes, but also butter is a really important ingredient that plays a role that is interesting to understand, because also can help us to adjust the recipe to the texture that we want on the final product.
Okay. Exactly, you are absolutely right, Jordi. Like, we can play with. We don't have time for such a long masterclass, but we could analyze all these ingredients and think, how can we change it? We can make this recipe vegan, yes, of course. Can we make this recipe even healthier? Yes, we still can, right? We focused on getting a similar texture, or on cutting down sugars, on making it gluten-free, but there's still lots and lots of modifications possible. So also feel free to experiment, to try different starches, to try different flours, to try different results. But what we wanted to give you today, right, like, is this a little bit more knowledge and conscience, right, like to be more conscious when using starches, like, why am I using starches, what for, how can starch help me in this particular recipes, which starches do I have available, like, what do they give me as the final effect. I think we are quite happy with our cake. Looks quite nice, tastes quite nice. Probably for someone who is used for high sugar cakes, it might be on the limit, because I find it perfect, and I think you liked it too, Jordi, as far
because I'm used to it.
Exactly, to eating much less sugar.
Yes.
But if you want, I made the same cake like in preparation for this webinar with 18% of sugar. The texture was even better because more sugar also helps with the texture, and it was a little sweeter. So no problem at all. Also to try to play with those quantities here. Then you can add a little bit more sugar, then lower the water amount. There's a lot of modifications possible. But today we just wanted to give you a general overview of how to use starches in gluten-free baking. Why do we use them? What for do we use them? How to choose your products. And now we would love to answer the questions. Hopefully we'll be able to answer them all, but let's see.
So.
If not, we'll have to do a next masterclass, Jordi.
Another one. There is no problem. Nitaya is asking which of the starches are the lowest in carbohydrates for low carb baking, and which ones work best to build gluten in combination with gluten.
I would just like to ask you, Nitaya, what is vital wheat gluten? I'm not sure I'm familiar with this name or with this. So if you could tell us. But as far as the first part of your question is concerned, obviously starch by definition is a carbohydrate. So for low carb recipes, it's kind of hard to rely on starch. But just like we explained, some recipes may contain 30% of starch because it's cheap. It's it's an easy way to build texture, etc. But we don't have to go overboard with starch. We don't have to abuse this ingredient in our recipes, right? You saw we had the 7% of added starch, and then we had the starch present in rice flour, but it was nothing close to 30%.
At the end, we have to think that the starches are glucose, links one to the other ones, and are ingredients that are high glycemic index, all of them. And we have to reduce and try to use more all the molecules that we have, no more proteins, more fats, more fibers, that are the three ingredients that we can say, three big molecules that has lower glycemic index. No, it is. I imagine that this is, for example, for produce ketogenic keto products in pastry, and by using starches, you will always have high glycemic index in your recipes, and will be difficult to reduce low carbohydrates on the recipes. Then we can move to the next question if we have.
We have
Okay.
some 20 questions maybe to answer.
Okay.
But we're very happy that you're asking us and to interact. What does xanthan gum in gluten-free? What does xanthan gum do? I guess in gluten-free baking. How to use it? Well, it's very simple. I remember I kind of learned it also when we were preparing videos for our online Be Concept course, because we did one recipe of gluten-free recipe with xanthan gum and with starch, and I actually tried just to make sure what is the role of xanthan gum. Like, I did the same recipe with starch and without xanthan gum, and then with starch and xanthan gum. So the problem is, starch will give our dough viscosity and will help the dough rise, but once it is in the oven, it needs heat to actually for the granules to start swelling and build and help us build texture. So the problem with especially bread dough is we need the viscosity during fermentation, or right before we put the bread in the oven. We actually oftentimes count on this, whether we use yeast, whether we use sourdough, like we want this fermentation, and the problem is that the dough needs to have consistency. It needs to be a little elastic. It cannot be liquid. And if we just use starch on its own before we put it in the oven, it cannot give us any viscosity. So or barely any additional viscosity before we.
It's the difference between the gluten and starches, no?
Exactly. The gluten is activated when we make the bread or mix the bread in the standing kitchen mixer. Then gluten already, with a little water, it already starts making this gluten network and can capture the gas bubbles, whereas starch is only capable to do it once in the oven. So especially for bread and for the doughs that are that we want to that either ferment or that we want them to have this this pre-baking, increase in volume, etc. Those do require either xanthan gum or psyllium or another fiber that gives the dough viscosity and elasticity and allows the dough to expand and trap the air bubbles even before getting to the oven.
Even to work with the dough, because sometimes when we don't have xanthan gum in this kind of breads, we can even we have fibers in general that helps us to capture this water that we have. We cannot manipulate the recipes. And for this reason, we are using xanthan gum, and the xanthan gum, Adrianna, we mix directly with the recipe, because I never use it in that direction.
Yes, we can mix it already while mixing the dough, and we instantly see that the dough becomes much thicker, has more body. So this is very clear to the eye, the effect of xanthan gum in those dough.
We are used to work with xanthan gum on liquids, and we see that when we add xanthan gum, the texture, the viscosity completely change when we add xanthan gum, but when we are using in breads, for example, we cannot see this effect, and we don't understand exactly what is the difference. Okay, we move to the next question. Yes. For modified starches, are there any health concerns that we need to be aware of?
It's a very, I like this question, but one day I would like actually maybe a real, nutritionist or someone to come and answer, because, I'm not a chemist, I'm not a nutritionist. I cannot say with 100% certainty which chemical modification, has some implication or not. But just to explain you one thing, physically modified starches, like the one we used in today's recipe, do not involve, those modifications do not involve anything, not enzymes, not any chemical substances added, nothing. It's just like the treatment with heat or the pre-gelatinization, right? So these are physical modifications that basically do not change the let's say the nutritional or properties of these starches. So I don't see how could they be any more harmful than regular starch, right?
When we are thinking in
pre-gelatinized starch,
just what we do is to do something that we do in general with all the starches, that is bake it in order to increase the volume, no? And then we dry and we are going to use like that, no? That means that the change that we have is completely, for me, is exactly the same that we do in our recipes, but is one step before we are going to use it, no?
That's right, and I think there's a lot of controversy because even xanthan gum has a lot of there are a lot of people who say no, xanthan gum is very bad, or no, xanthan gum is good. I mean, the origin of xanthan gum is microbial fermentation. So one let's say one wing says like it's natural because it's produced by bacteria, and because it has to be done in the laboratory, because that other people can say, well, it's semi-synthetic because it's you cannot say that it comes directly from nature, right? So, but always a good thing is always to check. For example, in Europe, we have, I think, EFSA is the institution that conducts a lot of research, and we always check those ingredients. Like they post the latest decisions about. They keep testing texturizing agents, and they make very specific. They publish very specific reports saying, for example, like this is considered safe for humans, so there is no upper limit of consumption, right? This is considered safe, but only in a small dosage, etc. So we always check for those, but the physically modified starch, it doesn't even have it doesn't have to have the E number. It's optional. It doesn't have to say on the label even modified starch. It's only for chemically modified starches. But also when you think, what does it mean chemically modified starches? Some of them are chemically modified by cutting them with some enzymes, right? Like changing their properties, improving their functionalities. So I wouldn't be too afraid to use modified starches in general, because nowadays there's really, I think, as consumers are getting every time now more and more conscious and are asking for the ingredients and are reading online and are reading the studies about the possible harmful effects or carcinogenic effects of some food ingredients, right? Or additives, food additives. So I think nowadays it's really much more controlled, and the products that get the FDA approval or the European Union approval to be released on the market, especially also in the concentrations that we use them, like shouldn't be harmful at all. But as I said, we're not nutritionists, so we cannot answer your question in a full.
Now, the gluten-free baking uses a lot of starch, sometimes 30-40% of the amount of flour. It is possible to reduce the amount of starch. What and how to replace the starch in sweet pastries?
I think
in general, I think, Adrianna, this is something that for the cost also. Exactly. Because, for example, if we go to the industrial gluten-free recipes, like breads, for example, or cookies, we can see that it's expensive. It's expensive if we use, for example, rice flour, than starch inside of the recipe. And I think that we don't need to use this amount in order to have a good product. I think that we can reduce this quantity and use another flours. But I think that in general, the producers, mainly the industrial producers, they use this kind of recipes, of balance on the recipes, in order to cut the cost and reduce the cost of the product, and like that by using starches is cheaper than using, for example, whole rice
they
flour.
Use it a little bit as a filler, right? Like dry extract that we can put, that is cheap, that doesn't make any harm, meaning it's the taste is neutral, it helps us with the texture, so let's just put more of it. But it's the same like with many recipes that have lots and lots of sugar, right? Like we can put 35% of sugar even in something, but then we put 30 and we see that that maybe the recipe even improved. So as you saw in today's example, I think, Nadezhda, we didn't use 30% of starch, and our cake, we are happy with the results. So hopefully you don't need to use that much.
And if we want to replace these quantities of starches, it's just to play with the rice flour or the flours that we are using on the recipe. We'll be just changing one to the other one until we have something similar and we reduce the starch on the recipe. Laura, what are the starches with lower glycemic index?
Again, we come back to the same. There is no starch with low glycemic index, but the way to balance your recipe is actually to put as much fiber as you can without also going overboard and not making a crumbly dry texture. But like the more fiber you put, the better for the health, and just not to put too much starch in as well.
Then we have another question from Mike. What about xanthan gum in gluten-free mixtures? Does it substitute the starches?
It's a little similar like the other question, but no, it's complementary, right? Like just like we explained, like one acts before when we're mixing the dough, and the other acts and it helps with the aeration at this stage, and the other one acts more in the oven with the heat. So it's a complementary function.
We can say that xanthan gum is playing a little bit the role of the gluten that we have on the flour.
Exactly, like right, and then or maybe they divide. They both play the role of gluten, but one in the dough making process and the other one in the oven, right? But yes, that's absolutely right. And for example, in our pastries or in our types of cakes, in gluten-free bread, yes, we did use or psyllium or xanthan gum with starch, but in the case of cake, starch is just enough. So you can add xanthan gum, but there's really no need for it. So that's the difference for us as well.
Shinrat asked, do you need gluten to make pie dough like sugar dough with pâte sucrée?
I don't remember the exact formula for pâte sucrée, but I think it's it's not very different from pâte sablé. It just contains more sugar.
Pâte sablé for us, Adrianna, we are doing some recipes with Mariana for the course, and pâte sablé doesn't need gluten at all.
No, it's even like better if the gluten network doesn't really develop.
It's not. We can say that it's not exactly the same texture, but we are working with rice flour without starch on the recipe and without lactose. We work with just coconut oil, sunflower oil, and water on the pâte sucrée, and it works perfectly by just changing wheat flour for whole rice flour. That is the one that we use on this kind of pâte sucrée when we produce it. That means that we don't need gluten at all in order to create something similar. It's not exactly the same, but without gluten, this texture, it works.
And another question for Mike. It's a very good question. Why is it a good idea to add starches to gluten-containing to a dough that is made with gluten flour, I understand, or gluten-containing flour, to improve texture? Yes, it's sometimes also the way to bring tenderness to the recipes, especially because gluten can result, like if there's too much, let's say if there's a lot of flour, right, and we don't have much either fat or sugar, right, to compensate, right. Starch interferes with the gluten network and makes those doughs more tender. So actually, it is one way to balance also gluten recipes with starch, right? Starch will compete with gluten for the water. It will kind of interfere, not allowing the gluten network to develop that much, to overdevelop, let's say. So it's another way to to use starch in gluten-containing recipes.
Paulina asked if we can use other oil instead of coconut oil. For sure, we can prepare this recipe with sunflower oil, with olive oil, with other oils. The only thing is that the texture will be a little bit more oily. For example, now when we touch, coconut oil is crystallized, and if we put in a paper, like this one, if we have coconut oil, it will, I don't know how to say, it will expand the fat effect on the paper little by little. But if we have oil, this will be faster, because the texture will be softer. We will have oil inside, exactly the same, but it's not the same. Here is crystallized. If we work with sunflower oil or olive oil, will be not crystallized, will be liquid. That means that will be no more, I don't know how to say, more fatty, the texture. But for sure, we can change coconut oil for sunflower oil or olive oil or any kind of oils that you have in your country.
I would say that from my experience, Jordi, the only thing with this percentage that we have here would be that if you use some unsaturated oil at this amount, if your emulsion is not very good, later sometimes you have a cake, right, that expels the oil outside, and that can be problematic. So sometimes you just need to make sure that your technique is flawless in this case.
Gal asked if can you say what modified cornstarch you use it? There are so many brands and kinds, ratio of amylose, amylopectin.
Okay, so of course we can. There are so many modified starches. That's true. We used gel creme hot from Sosa, which is a physically modified starch treated at high temperatures, and it's from waxy corn, so it has 99% of amylopectin and 1% of amylose.
And we have Jonas. I would like to try baking with tapioca starch. Can you share some of your experiences with tapioca starch, and how was the texture after storing the cake in the fridge?
We didn't do that many tests. I did last week one of this cake with tapioca starch, and I have to say it was surprisingly nice. I would definitely make more tests, and like with not only with putting it in the fridge, but also in the freezer, freezing, defrosting, So we're not so accustomed to use tapioca starch, but I think it works well. It has a lower amylose content, but it's not such a bad thing, especially in, there's a big difference whether if this cake has the percentage of egg protein that it has, I think tapioca starch will work perfectly. If you reduce significantly the egg protein or even make this cake vegan, tapioca starch might not have enough amylose to give the cake the structure. So it very much depends on your specific recipe and the balance between the gelation of egg proteins and then the gelation of starch. So because from the top of my head, I think it's 18% of amylose tapioca starch. So it's not that little, but depending on your egg percentage in the recipe, and all the other ingredients, like you might find it enough or not enough. But definitely no, it didn't give any problems and much starch retrogradation because the amylose content is not that high.
I think that one exercise that is interesting to understand the different starches is to make this exactly the same recipe, the big concept gluten-free recipe, with just one starch, and do exactly the same with one starch, tapioca starch,
exactly.
cornstarch and potato starch, and like that you can understand what is the effect of each starch that you are using.
And then the second stage for me would be, because this is what we did, how we started, I don't know, 3 years ago, and we still keep doing it because we still have lots of things to learn, and every time there's more products, right? But yes, after this exercise, then you could also try to play with the concentration. Start from, because starch is usually used from like when it's added to those types of recipes between 4 and 8%. As you saw, we used 7, quite high, and now you can go like going down and see at 7, at 6, at 5, at 4, like how the cake volume changes, right? How the crumb changes, and you can, like this, you can find your sweet spot, your perfect starch concentration, and your perfect the perfect starch type for your recipe. We settled on this choice, but there are still many, like many possibilities of doing many more tests to adjust it even better to your needs.
Bill asked to us, do you prefer a cold process modified starch or hot process?
I imagine he refers to the gel creme hot or gel creme cold, like yes, or the starch that can work at room temperature, or the starch that was treated at high temperatures, but does not work at cold temperatures. Well, in this recipe we worked with gel creme hot, so the hot process, let's say, starch, but it really depends on the application. This was for baking, right? So we don't really need the starch to work before we put it in the oven. It's not the bread, it's the cake dough. We didn't need the pre-gelatinized starch, but where we...
For example, because in this kind of recipes, for sure we have to put in the oven, no? And we are going to, we can say, activate the starch that we are using.
That's right.
For me, in a personal way, I think that when we are preparing, for example, pastry cream, or I need to prepare a coulis, no? For example, it's easier, no, with a coulis to use, for example, the pre-gelatinized starch, because you go faster. You just mix fruits and this starch, and you can just use it directly.
For restaurant desserts, it could be perfect, right? All those sauces and little decorations that maybe can even need to be made to almost to order. So.
But then, for example, working with pastry cream, I prefer to use with the hot one, because you have more structure, in my opinion. Okay, it's much better, the structure and the texture that you have than the cold one. Okay.
But also modified, if we're talking about pastry cream, the modified starch, even the one that to use in hot conditions, right, helps us to prevent synersis, and actually makes our pastry cream, let's say, freezable, right? Because the biggest problem with pastry cream is you cannot freeze it when you use native starch. But when you switch to modified starch, you can actually freeze your pastry cream.
Lavina, could you please explain again how does the fiber helps with the starch? What does it do to the product?
I think you referred to the glycemic index, yes. Right? Like meaning, well, whenever we eat anything that is composed of simple sugars, right, and fiber, let's say, the fiber doesn't make the digestion, let's say, as easy. It's not as easy for the enzymes in our stomach to just like cut the for example, starch into simple sugars, glucose molecules. So the digestion is slower, and the release of the glucose molecules is also like done over time. It's not just as fast. It's not the same if we eat the starch just like it is right now, our body, or just like cut it into glucose molecules. I think I even remember from one study, in 20 minutes. I think if we eat like something that is like pure starch, that's why sometimes it can be a very quick pickup if we're very low on energy or something, right? Like a high starchy food without lots of fiber can give us a very quick boost of energy, almost as if we were eating a spoon of sugar. But on the other hand, when we have fiber, this process of cutting the glucose molecules, right, of cutting the long chains of glucose molecules into maltose and the glucose molecules is much longer. So it's just like the digestion is much longer, and for this reason, like there's no this high glycemic sharp rise in the blood sugar, like very fast, and then a sharp fall. It just becomes, instead of being so steep, it becomes more like a progressive line.
We are with Jonas. In my experience with vegan cakes, they are often very chewy and too soft. Can you give some tips about how to achieve and more satisfying texture in vegan cakes.
Oh boy, I think this is not only for another masterclass. This is for our next online course,
Yes.
or for, because this is really big. Just vegan textures in general. We discuss them in detail, also in our online course. But vegan cakes is really the level. You need a level of mastery of pastry techniques, of pastry molecules, of all the ingredients to really understand, because there's so many interactions, and when you cannot rely on proteins of animal origin, there's just so many things to take into consideration. But the chewiness, the only thing I can tell you, but without seeing the recipe, without knowing more, I don't think we can give you a very short answer to this complex problem. But you can check for chewiness how much starch do you have in those recipes,
because it's a problem that we find in some recipes that we have started to work in a vegan way, and when we use too much starch.
Exactly, 8% of starch, and especially when it was cornstarch, was just too much, and it was chewy, and it didn't work very well. So then also you need to be very careful about the water, and dry extract ratio in those vegan recipes as well, because it's a very complex
The first thing that, Adrianna, I think that we have to understand is that when we work in vegan cakes, we cannot achieve exactly the same texture than when we have eggs. For me, this is the first thing that we need to understand. And then there is solutions, more or less, that can be interesting to create these vegan cakes. But something that I discovered now with you when we started to do some tests with sponges and with cakes, in vegan option, was that by using too much starch, the textures became not interesting. That means that I think that we have to use maximum 3, 4, 5% of starches in this kind of recipes, and then use ingredients like, for example, rice flour, in order to have the quantity of dry extract that we need to use in these recipes, and play with the fats that we have now by using saturated and unsaturated in order to have softer textures. But it's quite difficult to explain here in 2 minutes, and it's something even that we have to work more and more and more in order to share with you this knowledge.
Exactly. Hopefully in the future we will be able to make a whole course about it, and then we will all learn even more about vegan cakes. I like my next question, what are the most common types of modified starches, and what should we pay attention for in the modified starch label? I think I'll repeat again: physical and chemical modifications. And among physical modifications, the most common one is the pre-gelatinized starch. So the starch that can be used in cold, okay? And then we also have, within either physical or chemically modified starches, we have starches that are either acid resistant or syneresis resistant, right? So they have this better resistance to amylose retrogradation. I would recommend really contacting your texturizing agent provider and asking him, look, I'm looking for a starch that works in acidic environment, or I'm looking for a starch that isn't prone to syneresis. I'm looking for a starch that can thicken in cold or room temperature conditions, right? And to get his advice, because honestly, today I was preparing for the masterclass, and I was seeing this list of 30 different, let's say, chemical modifications of starch, and it's really so difficult to explain one by one. But I think from a practical point of view, we don't need to understand those modifications that much. We need to understand the final effect. I mean, how did the functionality improve? Yes. What can we use this modified starch for? What advantage does it give us compared to regular starch? For example, we know that the gel creme hot gives us the advantage of of being able to freeze our pastry cream and not have syneresis, right? If we do it with the regular cornstarch, we cannot do it. The pastry cream doesn't work or exhibits syneresis after freezing and thawing. So basically, the important thing is to to ask the person that is providing you with different ingredients and texturizing agents, specifically the starch for you say, I want the starch for gluten-free baking, or I want the starch to work with acidic fruits. And in this way, they can advise you the best. But I hope I gave you a little overview of what types of modifications are there.
Adrian asked, what about acids? No, does lemon cake need some special kind of starch?
Yes, exactly. Starch is considered to be not to work. Native starch is considered not to work well in pH environments below 4. Now, depending how much lemon you will use in your lemon curds or lemon creams, right? Because lemon is very acidic. So actually, in order to get below the 4 pH level, you would use a lot of lemon and little water, right? But when you mix lemon with egg yolks, with water or with butter, like the pH also changes. So actually, there are some native starches that would even work with lemon creams, but if you want to work in a very acidic environment, there are special modified starches that work well even at a pH equal to 3. So if you're really thinking about something very, very acidic or very acidic preparations, you should ask for those types of starches. But from our experience, we did make the lemon creams, and we used both modified starch and we used regular starch because the pH wasn't below 4. And it's considered that above 4, native starches work well. It's only below 4 that they give us problems. It's a bigger problem from practical point of view. I think syneresis and starch retrogradation is a much bigger practical problem in the life of a pastry chef than the acidic environment, right, Jordi? Because
yes, and I think in this kind of recipes, when we have acidity, one solution can be moved to pectins, no? Because pectins, they are allowed to work in this pH range, like 3.5, and it's easier to have, for example, gellification, no, gelation from the pectins without any problems than to work with a starch, or we can work on team. No, sometimes the solution is not work just with one ingredient, is to work with 2 ingredients that will helps us to achieve what we need. No? And in this case, we can work just with pectin or work with pectin plus cornstarch and have the solution with the 2 ingredients.
I see that Aina was asking us what modified cornstarch you use. So just repeating, here we use gel creme hot from Sosa, which is a physically modified waxy corn starch. And Svetlana is asking us if modified starch usually substituted in a 1-to-1 ratio with regular starch, or
for our experience, we can say that modified starch we can reduce a little bit. No, that means that I explain from the experience. I think that in recipes that, for example, we are using 4% of native starch, when we move to the modified starch, we are using 3.2, 3.5 in order to achieve a similar texture. But you can, if you don't want if you want to go faster, you just change 1 per 1, and then you adjust, no, by reducing a little bit the quantity to have exactly the same texture. It's not a huge difference. That means that if we are using 5% of native starch, maybe we will need to use 4.2, 4.5% of modified starch. But if we work 1 by 1 at the beginning, we try it and we see what's happened, and then we just need to adjust the percentage or the grams that we are using on the recipe. Okay.
And we can also see that some of you are asking us about the online course, maybe after seeing the video. So we'll also take now a couple of minutes to answer and resolve your doubts, and we hope this will help. So Carla is asking us, I specialize in vegan cakes and desserts. Will this course be suitable for me? I would like to take the course, but I'm a bit on the fence at the moment. Jordi, would you like
No,
to tackle this one? Vegan.
What,
Did you talk about vegan? Did you during the course?
I think that this course is important for everybody that want to understand what is doing in pastry, and if they want to adapt the recipes to the new necessities that we have on the market. No? That means that for me now it's impossible to try to make a recipe without understanding the ingredients. No, and in any direction. That means that even if I'm working on classic recipes, when I'm using classic ingredients like milk, like cream, like egg yolks, I want to understand the role of these ingredients that I'm using. And this is something that we explain in all the directions. No? That means that on the course we start explaining the fats, the proteins, the fibers, and everything involved in pastry. Even if you work in vegan and gluten-free products, for example, or you work in lactose-free pastry, or you work in classic recipes. No? And I think that is for sure that is necessary for a person that is working on vegan. I think is the most important, no, for me, persons that needs to understand better than the people that is working with classic recipes, because when we move to vegan desserts, we see that if we don't are able to control the classic ingredients, we cannot move to the vegan recipes, no, and it's something that. Also, there is a lot of vegan recipes. I think that more than 50% of the recipes of the course that we produce, no, more or less 40-50% of the recipes even are vegan. No, because
exactly. And you can, if I might add, Jordi, like you can even, I think in the program of the course, we have icons, so you can see exactly how many recipes from module 4, Jordi's elaborations, are vegan or egg free or gluten free, and it's really like we calculated it. It's just like Jordi says, more or less half of the recipes. And in module,
I think final products we have 1 or 2 that are completely vegan,
exactly,
but then in the other products almost there is 1, 2, or 3 recipes that are vegan. No? And this is just
for each product, you mean?
For each product.
Mm-hmm.
No? But at the end, for me, the most important thing is to understand what we are doing in our recipes, to understand the ingredients, to understand the techniques that we are using in order to create the texture, to understand how to formulate, because I think the more important part of the course is that we invested a lot of time to create videos in order to explain how to formulate a lot of kinds of recipes and texture, and there is a module only for the vegan mousses, no, because
exactly.
vegan mousses and light with a light texture, with healthier ingredients, is quite difficult to create.
And it took us years of development work, right, and research. So actually, like I really think
we invested a lot of time in order to explain everything that is important, that is involved in this kind of recipes. For me, I think it's interesting. For you, but then it's just.
Of course, it's a personal choice. We had vegan students already in the editions that either finished or are finishing now, and they were also on the fence. They called us, right, to ask exactly how many recipes are vegan, what, and we hope, well, at least from the reviews we got from them, that they are 100% happy, because they learned, they understood better the ingredients, right? We can tell you in the techniques, there's the pastry techniques module. We also work or show how to work with aquafaba, or we talk about plant-based proteins. Even if the course is not 100% vegan, we give you a lot of tools so that you can make your vegan recipes. And it's very interesting, because now the final exam of the course is the recipe formulation, your own recipes. And many of our students who didn't declare themselves maybe vegan, or they sent us vegan recipes, because maybe for their clients or for their pastry shops, this is the type of recipes that they wanted to learn with this course. So we can actually see that they did learn to formulate their own vegan recipes. So hopefully, please check again. If you have any more questions, just write to us. Remember, you can send an email and ask us any other doubts and questions that you have, and we want to solve them all. before you sign up for the course, because we understand that it's a big investment in yourself and in your pastry, and we want you to be 100% satisfied.
We can say, Adrianna, that the 20th...
Exactly, that on the 20th of September, if you still have some doubts, or 22nd of September, 22nd.
Just one second. No. Marta, 20 or
22nd of September is the course in explication webinar, right? 22nd, yes. 22nd of September, we will have a webinar where we will explain in detail the course, because we get a lot of questions by email, and we want to make just like a short webinar to solve all your doubts as well. But in the meantime, if you have questions that we can solve through email, please don't hesitate also to ask us.
James, I think, was the same question. And Carla, then we have a gluten-free. Hello, team. I'm specialized in gluten-free baking. Will the concept course be stable for me?
That's a very interesting question. While the course itself focuses on water-based textures, creamy textures, aerated textures like mousses, and gel textures like gelays and compotes, then you will have also in the recipe booklet from module 4, you will find dacquoise, sponge cakes, cake examples, sablé examples that are all gluten-free. So it's your decision. The whole course, the theme of the course, just like the theme of today's webinar was starch, or starch with special regard to gluten-free pastry. We cannot guarantee that the Big Concept online pastry course is dedicated just to gluten-free baking, but you will find many recipes, and more importantly, we think that you will learn how you can make your gluten-free recipes, by how you can work with the ingredients that you choose. You will understand how eggs and fats and sugars work in a sablé dough, so that later you can develop your sablé dough with gluten-free sablé dough. And you will have some examples of Jordi's gluten-free, many examples of Jordi's gluten-free recipes for crumbles, for pâte sablé, for cakes.
Because all the recipes are gluten-free. All the recipes that we are working on, all the products are gluten-free, because we know that in all these kind of sponges and crunchy textures that we produce, we don't need gluten at all. And we are working with this philosophy since, I think, 3 or 4 years now. And I think we don't have more questions, Adrianna. We have a lot of
many sweet words that you sent us, and we are really very touched by this. It's our pleasure to see the students, or like just participants from all over the world, to join those free masterclasses. So our next masterclass, we will repeat this masterclass in Spanish and on September 20th, and then for sure we will also have other ones in English soon. But please remember that if you're interested in finding more about the Big Concept online pastry course, on September 22nd, we will have a webinar in English to explain and resolve all your doubts. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And see you soon.